Hi, welcome to our focus on the key concepts that we turn to when we're trying to decide if an assessment is a good one or not. And I've got a lot of terms up here on the board, and we're going to slowly make our way through them. And my hope is that at the end, what you're going to feel is that really I've just put words on what you instinctively already kind of knew about assessment, what must be true about an assessment if it's good. And so a lot of this hopefully is not new information, it's just new terms putting on your own common sense understanding of what we need from assessment. Now, some of you who've gone through the education program or you're in the process of going through the education program, you will have already had an assessment class. And you might be looking at these terms and you might be thinking, hey, I already know these. So what you can get from this is maybe an even deeper understanding with some additional examples that breathe life into it. But maybe more important, what you're going to get is you're going to get a focus from a language learner's perspective. All the assessments that I talk about here are mostly focused on language assessment or a content assessment that also is indirectly at least measuring language development for language learners. So what are these key concepts? The 5 that we turn to over and over again, and when I was going through school 22, 24 years ago, really it was validity, reliability, and practicality that we turned to. And now authenticity and washback are very much an important part of what TESOL professionals are thinking about when we're thinking about assessing language. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through all of these. I'm going to express to you what they mean to me, kind of what the meaning, the definition that I'm walking around the world with. You have 2 fantastic readings, one from an old book that I learned from when I was going through school, and then you have a newer book by Brown, a chapter. So there's a chapter from both. And both of them talk about these concepts, and you'll see that the older book really just focuses most on validity, reliability, and practicality. That's the way I was taught. The newer book focuses just as much on washback and authenticity. And what I'm hoping is between this lecture and looking over those 2 chapters, you get what you need to really understand those terms. And so we're all saying it a little bit differently. We're all giving slightly different examples, but hopefully that breathes life into it for you. And then you're going to see over here there's some related terms, some kind of dimensions of some of these that we need to talk about as well. And while we're talking about these key concepts that we turn to know whether or not an assessment is good or not, one of the things that will come up a couple of times at least is a lot of assessments that are given, especially standardized commercial big assessments that we give to anyone, including language learners, are multiple choice. And designing good multiple choice items is not an easy thing, but it's absolutely crucial, especially for validity and reliability. And so where we're going to end today is I'm going to walk through what are the different parts of a multiple choice item. You have taken thousands and thousands in your own student life by now. And maybe if you've started teaching, you've also given them as a teacher. And so we're just going to start labeling those pieces, and by labeling them, that's going to give me an ability to talk to you about how do you know whether an item is a good one or a bad one. So this is kind of bring it down to a specific kind of item, but it's a really crucial discussion for us to have at this point. And with all of this, what I am very, very hopeful about is that if you are leaving this program and stepping off into a teaching situation in which there's very little structure already, maybe you head off to teach in Guatemala, and there is kind of an English program, kind of, But there's no placement assessment, there's no achievement assessments that have already been created, that kind of thing. What I'm hoping is that you get enough from this lecture and from all of the lectures in the program, but maybe especially here in this lecture, you get enough that when it's your turn to be the designer, when it's your turn to be driving the bus and choosing or making assessments, this is your vision. This is the way you see the world. And you just begin to be asking the kinds of questions that these concepts are really suggesting that we ask. And so it really helps you to make the most optimal decisions. And if you make some bad decisions, this framework, this understanding, gives you the ability to fix them very soon so that you're able to get on the right path very soon. Now, many of you are headed off into perfectly designed programs. If you're going to be, say, a teacher in Washington State, you will have a placement assessment already that you will be assisting with administering, or that your students will take through the use of the English Language Development Coordinator. You don't need to design a placement assessment, not a formal one, and not a standardized one at least. And there will be lots of assessments already in place for you. For you, this framework is a chance for advocacy. This is a tool for advocacy for you, because hopefully, if you haven't thought about these concepts too much to this point, this is going to open your eyes. And once your eyes are open, you're going to be paying attention. You're going to be really starting to think at a more deeper level about the assessments that either you or others are giving to your English language learners. And when you notice issues using this framework, it'll give you the avenue for speaking up and advocating on behalf of your students. So whether these lead to action directly in creating or choosing assessments, or these lead to action more indirectly through advocating for your students when you see problematic assessments, either way, that's a great outcome. And that's what your future students need from you. Okay. So I'm just going to start walking through these and providing as I can examples from my own experience and things assessments that I've seen work well, or assessments I've seen go awry, and then we'll move on to multiple choice items. Okay, so each of these 5 concepts, there's either a question or a set of questions that are right behind them. So with validity, the big question is, does the assessment measure what we think it measures? Does the assessment measure what we think it measures? Okay? And so the first dimension of that, and this will help you understand what validity really means, is construct validity. Now, one of the chapters that you'll take a look at, the Brown chapter, chapter 2, they focus on a lot of other kinds of validity that I don't mention here. And these are I'm just emphasizing the 3 that I think for you at this point in your career, these are the ones that are most important for you. And there's even one that Brown claims is not that important for classroom teachers. I completely disagree, and I'll tell you which one that one is. Okay, so with validity, the first kind of validity, the first dimension of whether or not a test really measures what we think it does, is construct validity. Now, what does construct mean? Construct means an idea or kind of a framework of ideas. An example for us. Most of you have taken second language acquisition, ESLG 480, and so there is a construct that you have, hopefully, in your minds called BICS and CALP, right? And this is not an idea, this is a whole cluster of ideas. It's a framework. And so when someone says, or you read BICS and CALP, what's going to come up for you is this whole cluster of ideas that school language is actually two languages. And there's the social and there's the academic. And you, by now, if you've looked at BICS and CALP, you already have a sense of what kinds of situations that social language comes up in and what kinds of situations that academic language comes up. Another dimension of your understanding of that construct of BICS and CALP is you have a sense that BICS, for most students, comes first. And it happens somewhere between 6 months and 2 years it develops. Whereas with CALP, CALP for most students, not all, for CALP for most students develops second, and it takes much longer. It takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And there's disagreement about how long that takes, and that's part of your construct too, knowing that there's a little bit of disagreement about that. Other parts of your construct are knowing what are those dimensions that speed up or slow down progress with BICS and CALP. So let's say that you are teaching, or someone else with you is teaching English language learners, and they are beginners, and the focus is the functional language that they need in a school situation. So maybe you're doing a 2-week really intensive look at what's the language we use to ask for directions, how do we introduce ourselves, how do we ask to borrow something, right? What are those politeness markers, and how do they show up in language? All of those things. So those are all some really key pieces of BICS. So if you're team teaching that course and your team partner, your teacher partner says, don't worry about the assessment, I'll come up with it, and then I'll just show it to you the day before. If your team partner shows you an assessment and what you notice is it's all testing CALP, all the items are testing CALP. They're all asking about the language of directions on worksheets, not how to get to the cafeteria. They're all using the language of, say, science, so that specific discipline of CALP, that kind of thing. Then that would be a construct problem. That's construct validity. Because if you and your team partner give that assessment to your students, then your assessment is not measuring what you think it is. You think it's measuring BICS, but it's actually measuring CALP. And I'm quite sure the students would not do well on it, and you would have no measure of what they've actually developed, what they've grown in with you with BICS. So I'm hoping that starting with construct validity, that really gives you a sense, and a powerful one too, that you're in the driver's seat to keep making sure the assessments that are put in front of students really measure what we think they do. And I'm hoping that that example too makes you realize that everything you learn in this program about how language develops and the stages students take and the things that we can do to help them, all of that comes into play here, because your eyes need to be open in this way, and you need to be accessing those frameworks that you've learned. Okay. The next type of validity, the next type of way of checking, does the test actually test what we think it does, is empirical validity, which asks a slightly more focused question, which is, do the results make sense in terms of the real world? So empirical, right, in the real world, real data, does the real world context match up with the results that you got from this assessment? So let me give you an example. Let's say that, let's go back to that example where you're teaching functional language to the students. Let's say that you are working every day, you're adding new functional language, you're adding new vocabulary, the students are using them, you're doing lots of role play, and they are obviously learning BICS. And then you end up giving them, you revise that assessment that I referred to before, you revise it so that the questions are not about CALP, but they're about BICS. So maybe the opener of one item is something like, can I borrow your pencil? And then there are 4 possible responses. One of them only is a logical response of how someone might answer. The other 3 have nothing to do with the question, that kind of thing. So now you've got an assessment that does actually measure BICS. Let's talk about those results. If those students that you're working with are still developing in their reading and writing, especially in their reading in English, those items are going to be really challenging, especially if what you were doing in the classroom was mostly listening and speaking. And so what's likely to happen if you give that assessment, the revised assessment, to your students, is that their scores are going to be very low, which is really going to puzzle you, because for 2 weeks, 10 whole days, you were intensively, and your team partner was intensively working with the students, and you were watching their BICS go up and up and up. You give them the assessment at the end of the day, on the 10th day, you give that particular assessment, and none of them get, very few of them right. And so a question you would ask yourself is, does this make sense based on what I know from the real world? And what do you know from the real world? That you've spent 10 days with the students and you've seen evidence in their listening and speaking that they understand, they can produce the right language at the right time, and you have watched them develop. Does it make sense? No, it does not. And so one thing you might think about changing with that assessment is to make it an oral assessment. You might make it an oral assessment. So on that 10th day, on that second Friday of this intensive course, instead of setting aside 30 minutes for the assessment, you could instead set up stations around the room, or have different activities going on where students are working with each other or working in groups of 3, and one by one, you and your team partner call over a student and you do an assessment much like you did in class. So you say to the student, okay, I'm going to give you this pencil. This is your pencil, and I'm going to ask to borrow it. And I want you to tell me it's okay. I want you to say yes, and I want you to use your best English, your polite English, to tell me that. And so you have a series of items, and you are listening for specific responses, and you're taking notes on exactly what the students produce. And then you and your partner grade them at the end, okay? You evaluate them at the end. So now, if with that assessment, that's going to make sense, because your students are going to do much better. They have a better opportunity to be able to show you what they can actually do with small talk language, BICS language that they need in the classroom. So empirical validity, that would clean up empirical validity, okay? Because you would get results that make sense in terms of what you know about the real world. But let's say that every one of those students is from an educational background, their previous education, every assessment that they have ever taken has always been on paper and pencil. And it hasn't been multiple choice. One thing that you will discover over time, students will tell you, is that multiple choice is called the American style outside of the US, because we're kind of made fun of that we rely on that so much. So chances are that they haven't encountered multiple choice before, but what they might expect is that they'll have to write some things, right? At least they'll have to circle something, something like that. And so if that's the case, if every one of those students, or most of those students, expects you to give them a paper and pencil test, and instead you are pulling them aside one by one and asking them questions orally, they may not take the assessment seriously. They may not respect it. They may not even view it as an actual assessment. And that is what's called face validity, right? Like face, like, ooh, to lose face, that kind of thing. And so when students respect an assessment, when they take it seriously, and when they truly see it as a legitimate assessment of what they can do, that assessment has face validity, right? So if your students expect a test to look like this, or any kind of assessment to look like this, and you give them one that looks like this, it may match up with what we know you actually are attempting to measure. The results may potentially really match up with what you know about the real world, but if students don't take it seriously, you're not going to get to that empirical validity, because they're not going to take it seriously. They may not even answer some of the questions. They may answer in a joking way. They're certainly not going to be stressed enough to really put their all into it. And so, okay, so now we've been revising this assessment that you could give for an intensive BICS kind of mini course. How could we take a really well-designed assessment? It's got construct validity. It potentially has empirical validity, but you can see, or you know from your own experience, it may very well have face validity issues. What could you do? Well, what you could do is from day one, tell the students how they are going to be assessed, right? Okay, and if it's true beginners, you might be using a translator. You might be using a student whose skills are slightly above the others that you can assist with some translating some words. And so you would give them a heads up, and you would actually put in the groundwork for that face validity, so that students take it seriously by the time day 10 comes. At the very least, you would want to talk about that a few days in advance, so that they take it very seriously, okay? So let's go back. Validity. Does the test measure what we think it does? And we've got 3 different kind of sifting mechanisms, ways to check for this. Does it match up with what we know as TESOL professionals? Do the results make sense given what I know about the real world? And face validity, do the students take it seriously, right? So all of those come into play. Now I'm going to throw in a term, we mentioned it very briefly in second language acquisition. I'm going to bring up this term again. I think I'll write it down so you can see it. We're going to talk about performance versus competence. So this might ring a bell. You might remember us talking about this in second language acquisition. And this comes out of work from Chomsky. We talked about Chomsky in second language acquisition, and Chomsky comes up again a little bit in our methods course. So one really important construct that you should have in your mind at any point about language learners is that there's what students show us they can do, but that's different from what they can actually do, right? So there's what students show us they know about grammar on an assessment, and then there's what they really know about grammar. And usually the case is that performance doesn't get all the way to competence. We're always attempting to get there, to really reach not just what the student can do on a rainy Tuesday morning when they miss their breakfast, but rather what can they really do with English, right? So we're always attempting to get down there. The reason I bring up this distinction is that when we think about validity, this is a great time to think about that a lot of these questions are really getting at, remember, we're trying to get at what students really know and what they really can do. And we don't just want to get at this particular performance. We want to get at what they really know and really do. If they don't take the assessment seriously, there is no way that we're going to get at what they can really do, their competence. And obviously, if the results do not match up with what we know from the real world, like for example, if you have, say, a class of 20 students and 10 are clearly at the top, they are excelling, and there are 10 who are really struggling. and you give an assessment, and what happens is, on that assessment, the students who are struggling the most, they do the best on the assessment, and the students who are doing the best in the class, they tend to excel, and everything else, they do the worst. You have at least empirical validity questions to ask, right? And it's very likely that the assessment was created so badly, it's very possible, that the students with the lowest competence performed higher than they really can. It's not really getting at their competence. And those students who are really excelling, the assessment didn't get anywhere near measuring their competence either. And so empirical validity leads us back here. And of course, construct validity, if we're measuring the wrong thing, if we're aimed in the wrong direction, we are certainly not getting anywhere near what students can do and what we think, what they think they can do, okay? So, validity, hugely important, hugely important. Okay, so we're gonna march down here to authenticity. And authenticity connects to validity in my mind, and that's how I put these in order. Yeah, just full disclosure, these are in GINA order. These are the order that I think of them, and so that's why they're there. So I think of authenticity. Authenticity comes up for me as soon as I start thinking about validity, because authenticity tells us that a test should test real language that real people use in real ways that they use it. And even the form of the assessment itself should look like real-world use of language as much as possible, okay? And there's another dimension of authenticity as well, and we'll talk about this again a little bit later, and that is that the assessment, you should be assessing in very much the way that you were teaching, right? So the assessment itself should be authentic to the way that the students learned, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But authenticity, the assessment should, for example, the assessment should not use antiquated Shakespearean forms of English when that's not what students are really going to encounter unless they're reading Romeo and Juliet, right? Unless they are reading some old poet or some old literature. And so authenticity tells us that we also should not penalize students for having a really healthy oral understanding of English, so really healthy BICS. So for example, if you give students an item in which it's a multiple choice item and there are 4 options, and there's the academic, the CALP option, but there's also the way it could be said in everyday language, that is a problematic option. That is problematic if you are only going to count the CALP answer as correct, because you are actually penalizing the English language learners who've picked up enough BICS that they know how language is used authentically, right? And when you are either choosing an assessment or you are designing an assessment, try to get those individual items or tasks that students are carried out, try to get them as close to how we use language in the real world as possible. So for example, if you've been working with students on being able to more closely listen to details when they're listening to a short passage, it would be more authentic for middle school, high school, adult students to be listening to short voicemail messages, right? Or to listen to the beginning of a voicemail recorder. So listening to someone say, "Hi, this is Gina. This is Gina's phone. You've missed me. But if you leave a message, blah, blah, blah." And so try to think about how to assess what it is you're attempting to assess, construct validity, in a way that we really use language in the real world. So think about doing that. Okay? So that is authenticity. And then we jump to a really key term, reliability. Reliability basically means consistency. And consistency means that you reliably come up with the same response, the same answer again and again. So one of the things that we ask ourselves with an assessment is, if I used this again next year with next year's group of students, would the results be about the same? If I gave this assessment again next week to my same group of students who just took it, would the results be about the same? If this assessment was given not just by me, a 7th grade science teacher, or a 7th grade pull-out sheltered ESL science teacher, what if it was given in all 7th grade contexts in the state? Would we consistently get the same results? So we need to know with assessments, we need to know we can really count on what they're telling us, and one way that we measure that is to find out, are they consistent? Are they consistent? So with reliability, there are, and the readings that you do are going to pull out some other pieces as well, but these are the ones that matter the most to me as an instructor, and that is rater reliability and test reliability. Okay, rater reliability, which is sometimes called inter-rater reliability, inter means between, is referring to the people who actually score the assessment. And so rater reliability is asking, so reliability says, is this assessment consistent? Rater reliability, the question is, do raters rate this assessment consistently, right? So if a student takes an assessment and you make a second copy of it and you give it to 2 different teachers, are they going to score it exactly the same? If so, that is a good sign that you have rater reliability, that it's clear how the instructors should assess both the objective and the subjective, or the performance. So objective, choosing true, false, multiple choice, and performance, where they have to create, say, a paragraph, and there's a very clear rubric. So are people scoring things the same? That is rater reliability. And I want to say a little bit about that, because some of you will either right away or eventually end up in a situation where, believe it or not, you are the TESOL leaders at your site. So if you're teaching in Guatemala, or you're teaching in Chile, or you're teaching in Thailand, you might find yourself with some leadership needs. And so if you, for example, help choose or help develop a placement assessment for students, incoming students at a program in, say, Thailand, probably you would want not just objective items to test listening and reading, but chances are you would also want to see what their performance is. Perhaps at least in writing, maybe in speaking too, right? Then that means that you have to think about, how are different people going to rate this? And even if it's only you rating it, well, you could get squished by a bus and someone else has to take over next year, right? So how do you create something, a tool, a rubric that can be used by you, by multiple people to come to the same result? So I can give you an example from right here on campus, the Intensive English program, the English Language Institute, where I have worked off and on for a long, long time. When students come in, they are given, as part of their assessment, they are given a speaking assessment. But the speaking assessment is an interview. And the students usually don't even fully realize that they're being assessed in the interview. There are 2 teachers in the interview. It's not recorded, but one of the teachers is asking the questions and the other teacher is taking notes. And they're on the interview sheet that both of the teachers have, there are clear, explicit directions on when to skip a question, or how many times you can repeat a question. And there's even a place for you to write down whether or not you had to repeat a question, and if so, how many times. And the questions in the interview are set up by difficulty. So if you reach one that a student can't answer, you, depending on how kind of stressed the student might be or other cues you're getting, you might opt to end that interview then. Or you can ask one more just to see if maybe that question was just kind of an oddball question and maybe they can answer another. And so there's this protocol that we follow. Then the student leaves and the door closes, and those two teachers, they talk about what did they see. And the teacher who took notes says to the other teacher, I came to the conclusion that this student is a high level 1 or this student is a low level 4 because, and checks it with the other teacher to make sure that the other teacher comes to the same decision. And if there's any decision at all, like one teacher is saying, I think it's a low 4, and the other teacher is saying, I think it's a high 3, they go back to the notes that were taken by the teacher who is taking notes to look back over them and come to an agreement which one it is, right? There are other ways that rater reliability plays out at the English Language Institute, and that is with the placement exams, students do a writing assessment. They're able to choose from several different questions. They choose one, and the question is basically a choose your challenge kind of situation because students choose the one that matches up with where they are in their English language development. If they are beginners, then there's a question for them. If they are very advanced, there's a question for them, but they choose. So they write their response. Those responses are collected. Students take them all at once. And then what happens is something kind of magical. All the teachers in ELI get together and we are given the rubric. What are we looking for? What does a 5 look like? What does a 4 look like? Then we are given benchmarks. These are papers, real papers that were written long ago. They've been retyped. There's no names on them. And these are papers that over the years we all consistently agree, this is a 5, this is a 4, this is a clear 3, this is a 2, this is a 1. So we look through those and we actually talk it through every single quarter. Why is this a 5? Why is this a 4? Why is this a 3? And then the next thing that happens is 5 papers are randomly, or more if there's more than 5 ELI instructors, the papers are chosen from the new group of placement exams, and we number them. And each of us numbers our paper, and we read each one, and we write down on our paper, so let's say there's 5, I would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 labeled on my paper. I would read paper number 1, and I would write down what I think the level is. Then I read whichever next one I can read, maybe 4, then I read 2, then I read 3, then I read 5. So I've got 5 scores written down. Then when we're all done, we talk through number 1. What is number 1? And if there's any disagreement, some of us are saying, oh, it's a low 2, and some of us are saying, no, it's a high 1. We talk it out until we all come to agreement, because that is how we are getting rater reliability. And then, once we make sure we are all on the same page this quarter, again, then we tackle the rest of the papers. Every paper gets 2 readers, and you don't see the other reader's score until the end, and then the director walks through them. Each paper's numbered, so that he'll say, number 23, and if you read 23, you say the number, the level that you assigned it. And if there's any disagreement with the other rater, then a third reader reads it and comes up with the decision. And we've never, I want to say never. We have occasionally, maybe over the last 20-some years that I've been here, had to have a 4th reader. But I give you that example so you have a working mechanism in your mind. You have a sense of the kind of effort and the planning that goes into making sure that people are assessing the same across different papers. Okay, test reliability. Well, again, reliability is, are the results of this test, does this test consistently test? Does this assessment consistently assess? And so test reliability is looking at, are there any issues with the test itself, right? So let's say, for example, you develop an assessment that needs to be taken on the computer. And you are teaching, let's go back to the Guatemala example, you're teaching in Guatemala, and you create a placement assessment that is taken on the computer. There's a computer lab that students can use. And students come in and they all take the assessment at the same time. But the problem is that in that part of Guatemala, in the windy season, right, then what you have is you have an electricity problem. And when you have an electricity problem, you have a computer problem. And when you have a computer problem, you have a test reliability issue, right? So anything that could get in the way of an assessment consistently giving you the same result over time. Let's say that the assessment that you have is kind of fuzzy, it's hard to read, maybe because it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. Then when that assessment is given on sunny days, those students are probably going to do a little bit better than when that assessment is given on cloudy days. So I think you're starting to see that with test reliability, we're trying to get a sense of, does the test consistently, or does the assessment consistently tell us the same thing, whether it's given on a different day, a different year, with a different group of students, that kind of thing, okay? So, is it consistent? Does it tell us what we think it tells us? Is it authentic? Does it match up with the real world? Is it consistent? And the next question we're going to look at is it practical, right? Does it make sense? So with practicality, there's lots of things that I think of. The first thing that I think of is I think of money, because that is a huge issue around the world. So is there enough money to practically be able to give this assessment whenever it is needed? So, for example, when I'm giving assessments, when I'm in Nicaragua, I am really, really careful to not have to use the photocopier very much, because that is a really big expense. Toner is very, very expensive. It's not just the paper, it's the toner, and then if the machine were to break down, then that's a huge expense on the program, on the school. So one thing that I think about is I think about money. Another thing I think about is time. If you might create an amazing assessment, it's got so much construct validity, it really matches up, it's really, really authentic. Maybe it is taking students, you've been working in Guatemala with students on their everyday language, greeting themselves and maybe talking about where they're from with really simple language. So you get this idea for an assessment in which you will take the students to a nearby tourist town and have them talk with tourists. And you and a teaching partner will move around and be able to witness, maybe with a checklist or with a rubric, you'll be able to witness that communication, and maybe every student will get 2 chances with 2 different tourists. And so, wow, you know what? That has a lot of validity, that has a lot of authenticity. It might not have practicality. It might cost a week of salary for the gas that it would take to get the students to that town. And it might mean also giving up an entire teaching day, right? So there's lots of things to think about. And also, you have to think of the people that it takes to make it work. So, the example that I gave you, with the English Language Institute, when students come into the English Language Institute and they need to be placed into the 5-level program, they are given a listening assessment, a reading assessment. They are given a writing assessment. They write in response to the prompt I mentioned. And then they are given a speaking assessment. That speaking assessment has 2 teachers for every student. If you're the only teacher in your program and there's no other English speakers in the area that you can pull in on placement assessment day, then you wouldn't have the personnel to carry out exactly that form of the assessment. It might need to be amended. Maybe you still do the interviews, but it's just you, right? You're not checking yourself with anyone else. And then we would just hope that your results are consistent across the different students, okay? So practicality, does it make sense for the given context that you have? So construct validity, empirical validity, these are all kind of like reaching for the stars. You want it to be as ideal as possible. Authenticity is ideal as possible. Reliability. Practicality, feet are on the ground. Can you actually make this work in this particular situation? Often plan B is what you have to do. Okay. And practicality, for me, when I think of practicality, the next thing I think about is washback. And washback, which doesn't sound very pleasant, by the way, washback is asking the question, what is the short-term and longer-term impact on the students and the teachers from this assessment? So the short-term and the long-term impact. Most of the time when people are talking about washback, they're talking about negative washback. So in other words, impacts that we'd really rather not have. But I want to talk at the end, I want to talk about some positive washback as well. So with negative washback, what kinds of negative things might happen? Students might be so traumatized by an assessment that it actually takes away their love of the subject. So you might have a student who just loves learning English. They absolutely adore it. You give an assessment that for whatever reason, maybe it's too difficult, and it so distresses the student that they really never have the same enthusiasm again for learning. So that would be an example of negative washback. You might also find yourself, let's say that you're teaching in Africa, and the country that you're in doesn't even offer the TOEFL exam, and you're working with students who are hoping eventually to go to the United States and study at a university in the US. So one of the things those students need to do is to take a proficiency assessment. It could be the IELTS, it could be the TOEFL, probably it's the TOEFL. There's others as well, but those are the 2 most prevalent. And so let's say that there's the nearest assessment for them is TOEFL, but that means they have to actually leave the country to take it. So now they have to arrange for perhaps even an airplane fare, they have to arrange for a hotel, they have to pay for the assessment. Assessments are expensive in the US, right? Those expenses stay the same outside of the US. So it's very different for you or I to pay for a $100 exam than it is for someone whose family earns $100 a year to pay for that $100 TOEFL exam, right? And so, so let's say you have a student, it's your best of the best students, and they do all of this, and they take the TOEFL, regardless of whether they pass that assessment or not, they've now got a huge amount of debt. I know of a student, for example, his family sold the family hut in order to make it so that he could make it to the US, and part of that was taking the TOEFL exam. So those are some really sad examples of washback, examples of where an assessment really negatively impacts someone. There can be positive too. When I was a student like you and I was taking second language acquisition, I was taking it with an instructor named Kathleen Bardovey-Harlick. And it was a really tough class, and I loved it. And on the day of the final exam, we all showed up, and we sat down, and there were 2 things on all of our desks. And one was a stack of paper, like a blue book, a homemade blue book, and at the top it said, comment on this language assessment. And the other thing that was there was a mimeographed, it wasn't even photocopied, that's how old I am, a mimeographed copy of a full-page magazine ad that was an advertisement of an audio tape program so that you could learn a language. It was like old school Rosetta Stone, old school. And so basically what this assessment was asking me to do is to take everything I'd learned about what language was and how we learn it and what might help our learning and all of the constructs I had and comment on this. I learned so much about second language acquisition as I was writing my exam answer. I didn't know that I knew so much about it. And so that is a great, happy outcome, and that's positive washback. And actually the assessments that I create, I use quizzes with a few of the courses I teach in the ESLG program. And actually, I am always hoping for positive washback from that as well. Whenever I am able to create a question bank of enough questions that you can take the assessment twice, my hope is if you take it the first time, that you will go back and check what it was that you were iffy on, check that, learn a little bit more, and then take the assessment. So I'm actually hoping that you can actually get learning as washback from assessments. Okay, those are the key terms. So now we need to talk about, let's drill down, before I let you go, let's drill down to the specifics of what makes up an item. Now, a lot of times, those of us who haven't taken a class like this, we call, let's say you're going to take a quiz, for example, for this unit, you might say to me, you might drop by my office and say, how many questions are there? And that's the way we say it in kind of the everyday world, but when we're really talking about assessment, we call them items. And if you think about it, it makes sense because they're not all in question form. And so that's why we pull back from calling them questions. So an item is an actual, like if you do multiple choice on a quiz and there are 10, it's numbered to 10, we would say there are 10 items. You might, until this moment, have said there are 10 questions, right? But there are 10 items. And I say questions too, except when I'm remembering to put on my assessment concepts hat. Okay, now I'm going to move you over here so we can look at this in just a moment. But I'm going to walk through these terms, tell you what they mean, and then we're going to go right next door on the board and take a look at an example and then make sure that you're really clear on how they work. And then I'm going to talk to you about what are the typical ways that new instructors write horribly bad multiple choice items. So that you can just bypass that right now and you can write multiple choice items as if you've been teaching 5 years by the time you are writing your first ones. That's my hope for you. Okay, so an item is what you would have formerly called the question. The stem for multiple choice is that part that's right next to the number. So it might be 1 period and then it says something. That is the stem, right? And it's again what you might have called the question before today. So that's the stem. Now there are options. If it's 4 options, multiple choice, A, B, C, D, there are 4 options. One of them is going to be correct, hopefully. And that is, we call it either the correct response or the key. I think that the deeper into assessment you get, the more they're going to call it the key. But some people call it the correct response. How about those, let's say that A is the correct response. What about B, C, and D? What do we call them? They're options, just like the correct response is, but more importantly, they are what are called distractors, okay? So they are distractors. So let's move. I'm literally going to move you down here. And let's take a look at this. All right. So take a look at this, not question, item. This is a multiple choice item, right? I've pretended that it's happening mid, so I've got it numbered 4. And so this whole thing is the item. This is the stem. All of these are options. One of them is going to be the correct response or key, and the other 3 are going to be the distractors, okay? So let's talk about the stem, first of all. one thing that new teachers tend to do when they write a STEM is they write a short one. And here's what you want to do. You want to teach your students that when they have the misfortune of having to do multiple choice questions, that they shouldn't look at the options, not at first. They should read the STEM and say the answer to themselves in their heads. They should say the STEM. Now, can you do this with this STEM, the tree? No, you can't. It's too short. This needs to say something like, the tree was well loved because, right? Or the tree had 3 qualities. And so what you would teach your students to do is to say to themselves what those answers are, and then look in the options for which one is the key, right? And so the first piece of advice I'm giving you is make sure that the STEM actually has enough that students can predict what the correct answer is going to be. Otherwise, it's really not going to measure what their competence, okay? So another thing that we need to talk about is we need to talk about, for the options, making sure that they are parallel. Now, in an